A Sunday school teacher was explaining the story of the prodigal son to her class, clearly emphasizing the resentment of the older brother as he expressed it towards the younger brother. When she finished telling the story, she asked the class, now, among all the characters, which one was really sad the prodigal son had come home? And like most days, she received a bunch of blank stares. However, one little boy quickly raised his hand, and relieved at least one kid was paying attention, the teacher said, "Timmy, please tell the class who was sad when the prodigal son returned." "Oh," he confidently replied, "it was definitely the fattened calf." I know this parable has been told so often, and perhaps that joke as well, but we tend to dismiss it, right? And we think we already know what it's all about. But while the focus seems to be on the prodigal son who experiences his father's forgiveness, we forget that the father is merciful not just to one son, but to two. There are two brothers, and each one reacts differently to the father's mercy. Their lives are both very different, but they succumb to the same enemy. The younger brother has lived a party lifestyle, sex, drugs, rock and roll, or whatever the Jewish equivalent of rock and roll was at the time. But the older son, he chose loyalty, duty, and service, yet both succumb to the same enemy. That enemy? Pride. You see, pride is a chameleon, and it can disguise itself in many ways. And for the younger son, pride came in the form of being too embarrassed to admit his faults. You see, sin had led him away, but pride initially kept him away. When the son had freely spent everything, the gospel says, a severe famine struck the country and he found himself in dire need. Now, instead of returning to his father, he chose the pigs and longs to eat what they ate. And he must have thought, I'm just too embarrassed to return. How can I return after all that I've done? He thought his sins were insurmountable, and in his embarrassment, he couldn't let the Father love him. And how many of us have ever thought the same? Like, trust me, I'm an expert at this. In high school and in college, I would purposely not go to the parish that I attended for confession, because I knew the priest there. And even if the parish was on the other side of town, I would go behind the screen and purposely try to make my voice deeper, you know? But in whatever way you do it, right, the important thing is to go to confession and admit your faults. There was the story of this Prussian king, Frederick the Great, who was once touring a Berlin prison. And as he passed by, many of the prisoners fell on their knees, shouting out, "I'm innocent, Your Majesty. Please release me." All except one man, who remained silent. So King Frederick stopped, called the man, and questioned, "Why are you here?" And the man replied, "For armed robbery, Your Majesty." And then the king asked, "Are you guilty?" He said, "Yes, indeed, Your Majesty, I deserve my punishment." Frederick then summoned the jailer and ordered him, "Release this guilty man at once. I will not have him kept in this prison where he will corrupt all the fine, innocent people who occupy it." You see, the truth will set you free and release humility all around. You see, while pride afflicted the younger son in that way, for the older son, it was through resentment. The older son, in seeing how lavish the father's mercy was for his brother, got angry. And he allowed his anger, which often that's what anger does, grow into resentment. You see, resentment comes from the place where we feel the need to blame someone else for our current condition. He was resentful not because anything was taken away from him, but because someone else got something he wanted. In light of God's mercy, he believed all his good behavior meant nothing. And that too is pride at work. But what is the antidote to pride? It is cultivating humility. Humility is simply admitting the full truth about ourselves and our situation and the nature of God. You see, the problem for both sons is that they didn't reveal the full truth about themselves or about their father. The younger son says to the father, "I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." And that's true. But what is the response to the father when the younger son admits his sin? He says, "You are my son. Bring the finest robe, put a ring on his finger, symbolizing the authority of the father in his household. Put sandals on his feet so that he can walk in freedom." Whereas the younger says, "You know what? I'm disqualified because of my sins. I don't deserve this." The father reveals the full truth. "Yes, my son, you've done all these things, yet there's nothing that you could ever do that will stop me from loving you." The older son says, "All these years I have served you, and not once did I disobey you, yet you've never given me even a goat to feast on with my friends," and that's true too. But he forgets the rest of the story. The father says, "You have been with me all this time. Everything I have is yours." You see, both sons don't reveal the full story. It's not enough just to tell our side of the truth. We also need to hear the Father's voice. And that's the only place where we learn to let go of embarrassment, resentment, and any kind of pride. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Blood Diamond, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, right? It's set during the Sierra Leone War in Africa and tells the true story about a country that's torn apart by the struggle between the government soldiers and rebel forces. And the main character, Solomon Vandy, dreams of a day when his son will become a doctor. But all his dreams are shattered when rebels invade his village, kidnapping the entire family, kidnapping Solomon, and eventually he had to work in the diamond mines. And working in the mines, Solomon finds a huge pink diamond and quickly hides it. And through a series of events, he's arrested by the government army, but later is released to look for his family in exchange for the diamond that he hid. Solomon discovers his wife and his daughter in a refugee camp. However, his young son, Dia, has been recruited and brainwashed by rebels to work for them. And the movie then recounts his entire journey, this journey of a father searching for his son and the diamond. But there's one particularly moving scene where Solomon encounters his son in the jungle, and he's pointing the gun to his head, the son is. And the rebels have so brainwashed the son that Dia has now become a hardened killer. And conflicted within himself, the son is not sure whether to kill his father or not. And at that point, Solomon sets his gaze upon his son and says, "You are Dia Valde," calling him by name. "You are a good boy who loves soccer, and I know those rebels made you do bad things, but you are not a bad boy. I am your father who loves you, and you will come home with me and be my son again." That's the full truth. That's humility. The younger son in Jesus' parable wants to return home as a slave, and the older son thinks he has always been working for his father as one. And we get trapped into that sort of thinking as well. But the father reminds them, neither of you are meant to be slaves. You both are free as my beloved sons. So too does God remind us of the same whenever we think we are anything below our true worth. He says, "I am your father who loves you. Remain outside no longer, but come home with me and be my beloved sons and daughters once again."